In the race to build an atomic bomb, who was left behind in the pursuit of a false sense of security? This story starts in 1945 with one man, J. Robert Oppenheimer, but the people affected total in the millions, and the fallout of that decision continues to this day. Throughout this season, we will look at the shadow left behind by Oppenheimer and the lives that exist within that shadow, impacted communities, nuclear workers, and more. We will also look at the way that pop culture, specifically the Christopher Nolan film, tends to focus solely on the man and not those left behind in the shadow. I'm Jacqueline Shing, and this is The Shadow of Oppenheimer. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb, known as the Little Boy, on Hiroshima, Japan. The resulting destruction was anything but little. 3 days later, on August 9th, the US dropped another atomic bomb, this time on Nagasaki. On the heels of these bombings, Japan surrendered. The US military, after the destruction, estimated that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed around 110,000 people combined, though more recent studies believe that the number killed is closer to 210,000. The true number of those lost will never quite be known, owing to the lack of population data of the cities before the attack and other limitations. In many cases, entire families were killed, with no one left to report the deaths. And while most of those who died were killed instantly by the blast, many of those who survived the initial attack were too grievously wounded by burns and radiation poisoning that they too soon died.
I don't think the majority of people knew what had happened, and that's why people who got injured came to the triage center or came to people and asking where did the bomb hit. Many people didn't know about it. Because of that, doctors who quote unquote survived the moment and tried to attend to the patients, the injured people, doctors were puzzled because people who look less injured, people do not have serious injuries or people do not have external injuries, but they started dying one after another days later or weeks later. So that really puzzled the medical doctors.
That's the voice of Dr. Yuki Miyamoto, a professor of nuclear ethics at DePaul University and a second-generation Hiroshima Hibakusha. Hibakusha, translated to English, means bomb-affected people.
I was born and grew up in Hiroshima, and my mother's family was a mile away from the hypocenter at the time of the bombing. But my mother was a little bit out of the house, and but she was not injured externally, so she survived at the moment. And I put this quotation marks around the survived. It's because when you are exposed to radiation, you don't know if you survived. You might have survived, again, quote unquote, at the moment of the bombing. But like my mother, many people suffer afterwards. Like my mother didn't tell me about her experience, but she suffered from Meniere disease, which is kind of having vertigo. And then in her 30s and in her 40s, she had to get blood booster shots every other week because often radiation destroys the blood producing organs. So she needed that kind of blood booster shots. And in her 50s, she got cancer and she passed away at 62. That's the reason that I hesitate to use the word survive or referring to those people as survivors. So instead, I often use the term sufferers or victims. And that's my mother's. And my grandfather was coming home from the hospital where he was working on the night shift. And on his way back home, he witnessed the atomic bombing somewhere. And he also didn't have any external injuries, but he passed away from acute radiation sickness 2 weeks after the bombing. But when I was growing up, everyone has a hibakusha in their family members. If it's not a parent or parents, grandparent or aunt or cousins.
Dr. Yuki Miyamoto told me about the horrific aftermath of the atomic bombings and the lack of understanding and resources to adequately take care of those who lived through the initial attack.
There was no medical, everything was burned down and broken down. So there was not enough medical facilities and also, of course, people and medicine. Nothing was sufficient enough to take care of the patients. And the government sent some soldiers to take care of the chaos. But then soldiers who came into the city, they were basically dealing with the dead bodies, the heavily irradiated bodies. So they themselves became ill and they fell ill or they died from acute radiation sickness.
In the memories of the Hibakusha, the wreckage and chaos of the bombings are seared into their minds. Coco Kondo was 8 months old at the time of the Hiroshima bombing, but the memories of that day and the aftermath has had a lasting impact her entire life. In an interview for ICANN, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, Coco Kondo recounted one of her first memories of the aftermath, where she was being comforted by a group of girls. She remembered that, quote, "I could not see their faces. Their lips were seared to their chins. Their eyes would not close because of the burns," end quote. The Japanese people were entirely unprepared for the brutality that was unleashed upon them. It didn't help that there was a lack of communication from the Japanese government because they didn't want the citizenry to be demoralized.
The government didn't really communicate. They probably suspected that this was the new kind of bomb, the atomic bomb, but they also didn't want to demoralize people because already at that point, a lot of things were lacking. There was no food, there was not enough clothes, there was not enough this and that. And then the atomic bombing. So the government didn't want people to feel demoralized because the war was still ongoing. And therefore, they actually concealed what had happened.
But even a year after the bombings, the magnitude of destruction and the horrific radioactive effects from the atomic bomb still really wasn't publicly well known. That wasn't an accident. The US government and military worked to keep the world from knowing. Soon after the bombing of Hiroshima, President Harry Truman broadcasted a statement nationwide in the US.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction to supplement the growing power of our armed forces. In their present form, these bombs are now in production, and even more powerful forms are in development. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East.
That announcement, according to New York Times best-selling journalist and historian Lesley Blume, was essentially an advertisement for the atomic bomb.
An advertisement not just for the bomb, but the U.S.'s monopoly of nuclear weaponry. Initially, the announcement by President Truman, it had quite a bit of fanfare about it. He was announcing that a weapon had been used, a new weapon, atomic weapon that was the equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. And that was an astonishing stat for the day. I mean, some reporters who were hearing this through the wires, they didn't even believe it at first. Walter Cronkite was a young reporter then in Europe, and he changed it to 20 tons of TNT before he let that go to press. And then, Truman also used language that was pseudo-biblical, which is kind of common at the time to describe the bomb. I mean, he was saying, we have released a new weapon that draws its power from the sun. The U.S. government was making a big deal about the strength of the bomb and the fact, again, that the U.S. was the only one to have it. And that also, they made it sound like there was an inexhaustible supply of these weapons, which, as we know now, there wasn't an inexhaustible supply. But it really had, the initial announcements about the bomb really had the whole patina of omnipotence. This was a nation now that had something so powerful that nothing was going to stop it.
Lesley Blume wrote a book about the U.S. government's propaganda and information suppression campaign to hide the deadly aftermath of the atomic bomb. It's called Fallout, the Hiroshima Cover-up, and the reporter who revealed it to the world. Cover-up is a fitting word for the U.S. government's efforts to conceal the human cost of the bombings. The U.S., occupying Japan after the war, controlled access to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and refused to let foreign journalists into the cities. The Japanese media was also forbidden to write stories about the bombings. Stories that the American public were allowed to see were limited to images of the mushroom cloud and testimonies from American soldiers. No bodies, no stories from the Japanese perspective.
Even in the giddiness of the Japanese surrender, there was still concern about, the U.S. not being, quote, seen as outdoing Hitler in atrocities, which was a quote from then Secretary of War Henry Stimson. He had already been worried about, the U.S.'s image, after the fire bombings of Japan. And so, winning the war in this way with such biblical grade decimation and devastation unseen before in human civilization, it can be a tough look. And then, a practical reason for them to have, downplayed the possibility of ongoing radiation was that the Allies were about to move tens of thousands of occupying troops into Japan, including the atomic cities, into Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And, the bombs had been dropped allegedly to save the lives of these servicemen and women. And, here they are about to go into potentially radioactive cities, decimated again by experimental mega weapons. And that's not a great look either. And so there were a lot of reasons for the government to downplay what may have been the after effects of the bombs. And, General Leslie Groves is really a band leader in the effort to downplay the after effects of radioactivity. And he even stated in a congressional hearing in the fall of 1945 that radioactive poisoning was, quote, a very pleasant way to die. And, the government really dominated the narrative in the aftermath of the bombings and the surrender. And it really wasn't until John Hersey's report came out more than a year later that readers really realized the true nature of the atomic bomb.
John Hersey was an American writer and journalist who traveled to Hiroshima to write about the aftermath of the bomb. His report uncovered what the U.S. covered up. On August 31, 1946, he released a 30,000-word account titled Hiroshima that told the story of 6 survivors. It captured the American public's attention instantly.
First of all, his report came out more than a year later, a year and a few weeks later. And, America by that time is well on a peacetime footing. And I mean, yes, of course, they're in the beginning of the Cold War with the Soviets, and there's the Soviet specter on the horizon. There's been a cooling down period after the war's end. And, the fatigue had worn away a little bit. I think at the end of the war, people's capacity to absorb stories about, horrific devastation of cities and horrific deaths, mass deaths and genocides. I mean, it had been so much. It was a global conflict, and every day on newspapers, there were pictures of decimated ruins. They were just numbed in late 1945. John Hersey put it quite succinctly and quite well, I thought. He said, he had seen ruins around the world as a war reporter. He said ruins were spectacular but impersonal. And, so it didn't really, photos of grotesque decimation, urban decimation, it didn't penetrate the public consciousness in the same way that his storytelling eventually would. But then we're looking at a year later. And so people maybe have a higher capacity to look at those stories again and absorb their true significance in a way that they might not have been able to do before, that they might have been a year or two, a year before. And, Hersey's approach also, it's not just timing, it's approach. He told the story of Hiroshima's devastation through the point of view of 6 normal people. What we would call in America like regular folks, right? Including, a young mother with young kids, a young female clerk who is at her job early in the morning, a young reverend with young family. There's a lot of youth in this. A couple of doctors and a German priest. And so the idea that Hersey had was to not just to tell the story of what had been like as a layman or as just an average civilian to see and survive this bomb, but also because they were average folks, it cultivated in Hersey's readers a sense of, terrible and unnerving empathy. Like people could see themselves in these protagonists. So yes, they're hearing about Hiroshima, but they're envisioning the same thing happening in like New York City or Akron, Ohio, or Houston, Texas. And so Hiroshima, it could have been any town or every town in Hersey's retelling. And, the Japanese citizens that he profiled who were so dehumanized in wartime propaganda, in the previous years, all of a sudden were highly empathetic subjects. People would hear about Reverend Tanimoto, but they would see their own neighbors or their own families or their young children in Hersey's storytelling. And it made just a huge impact. Hersey, he told the story in unflinching and graphic detail, and it was rendered in very deadpan prose that packed a punch. But I think another thing that made more Americans read it than they might have otherwise is that there was no lecturing in it. It was just literally retelling. This is what happened. And so in this way, like 3-pronged way, Hersey managed to make material that was unthinkable into imperative, compulsive reading. It was really the most astonishing feat.
What is also astonishing about John Hersey's Hiroshima is that his report was submitted and approved for publication by the War Department. It sounds unlikely, given the massive amount of effort the U.S. spent in downplaying the effects of the atomic bomb. On August 1, 1946, President Truman passed the Atomic Energy Act, which, among other things, restricted data concerning the manufacture and use of atomic weapons. John Hersey and his editors William Shawn and Harold Ross found themselves in a predicament. Hersey had not included any information that was previously classified by the U.S. government, but a specific list of classified data had not been defined by the Atomic Energy Act. Publishing Hiroshima without the approval of the government would put the team at risk of imprisonment, heavy fines, or even death. Ultimately, they submitted Hiroshima for review to the War Department, and also to General Groves, who had been the head of the Manhattan Project. The same General Groves who once said that the atomic bomb was, quote, a very pleasant way to die, end quote.
It was just basically like putting the report and Hersey into the guillotine, you would think. But then they get a callback from Groves' representative and says he's going to approve it. He just has some tiny changes to make to it. They weren't insignificant changes, it turns out, but still he's going to let it go. So Groves has spent, the first 6 to 9 months after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki really downplaying the less savory aspects of the bombing and the bomb. And then he's going to let out this very damning report. And, what I concluded was that, by that point, we're at a different stage of the Cold War. It's quite underway. And this is really, a time where Groves's mentality had shifted, and it was all about presenting to the Soviets. And, the US always, in his mind, was going to, they were not going to be monopolists of the bomb forever. The Soviets were going to get it. He thought they wouldn't get it for 15 to 20 years. Surprise, they got it in 4. But, he knew that the US was always going to have what he said were the biggest, and the best, or some variation of that. So while Hersey and his editors are looking at this report and they say, this might help end, use of nuclear weapons in the future. It might prevent it because the details are so horrific. How could anybody use these weapons again? Groves may have been reading that report and saying, Americans are going to read this and they're going to see the need for us to support a nuclear program, to have the biggest, the best, and the most, because they will see themselves as, they would be able to envision themselves as being on the receiving end of these bombs instead. And so perversely, Groves may have thought that John Hersey's report would drum up support for the ever-growing and new U.S. nuclear arms program.
The Soviet Union, wanting to push back on the perception that the U.S. had this atomic might, did a bit of their own downplaying about the bomb.
I mean, more than a little bit in terms of suppression. I mean, that was another kind of bonkers revelation in the research for Fallout. My entree into that storyline came from like a scrap of paper in the New Yorker's archives, where one of the editors had been following how the Soviets had been reacting to Hersey's report. So the Soviets totally suppressed Hersey's report, and they also suppressed information about Hiroshima from getting to the Soviet government's population because, again, the bomb was an advertisement of the US's nuclear monopoly. The Soviets would not have the bomb for, another 4 years. They had fallen behind in their own efforts. I mean, Stalin, when he learns that, there had been a successful test, immediately tells his people to accelerate efforts, so they can catch up. But in the meantime, until they do catch up and have their own bomb, the Soviets are at a grotesque disadvantage to their former queasy wartime allies. They hadn't gotten into Japan, in time after the surrender to be a part of the occupation. That scramble didn't play out for them. And so not only did they suppress the Hiroshima Hersey report to, I guess, really offset panic about the disadvantage, but they also sent a Pravda reporter on the ground into Japan who wrote like a counter report about Nagasaki, a pretty shocking, where he basically said that there were no radioactive effects at all. And, reports that the bomb had been, this mega destructor were totally overblown. And that, he supposedly interviewed a survivor who had leaped into a shallow ditch and watched the whole thing happen, with his head out of the ditch and had survived. I mean, it was so outlandish. So I had a Russian translator read through that entire report and transcribe it, and it really was as outlandish as you could imagine.
History loops. For the first time in decades, the global stockpile of nuclear weapons is expected to grow. Inciting Putin's nuclear threats and the invasion of Ukraine, nuclear hawks are pushing to expand the U.S. nuclear arsenal. The way we talk about nuclear weapons is worrisome too. In particular, the conversations around tactical nukes tend to provide a gross misunderstanding of what tactical really means. There is often a myth that tactical nukes have battlefield applications because they're smaller and have a lower yield. But many modern-day tactical nukes actually have yields far greater than the atomic weapon dropped on Hiroshima. So, how do we even fight back against these dangerous narratives and suggestions?
By calling it out, and just, I think, by really taking on the verbiage, by really making civilians understand what is meant by a low yield or tactical nuke. Government and military sources who employ it, they make it sound like it's like microdosing nukes. That's not a thing. Nuclear weapons are devastating no matter what size they are. And again, in a world where the Hiroshima bomb at 15 kilotons is considered to be low yield, I just don't think most people understand that. It strikes me, as you pointed out earlier in our conversation, as being comparable to the earliest efforts to really portray the bomb more or less as a conventional mega bomb. There was never any effort by the governments to cover up the fact that this was the result of new technology, and atomic technology. But, they were constantly describing the bomb's effects in terms of TNT and showing landscape destruction photos and that sort of thing. That kind of positioning really helped, at least in that first year after the Hiroshima bomb, to sort of portray them more innocuously or as being less dangerous, permanently dangerous than they really were. And so I just think, again, the onus is on us, it's on reporters, it's on watchdogs, it's on activists to really point out to not just the American public, but to citizens around the world, what these terms really mean and why they shouldn't be fooling anybody.
The way we talk about nuclear weapons is incredibly important, especially when the concept of nuclear weapons can be so abstract to grasp. The testimonies of Hibakusha and John Hersey's journalism keep the legacy of those impacted by nuclear weapons alive, and they remind us of the reasons why this work matters. They can provide us a guide on how to keep the conversation about nuclear weapons going in a meaningful way.
Well, I think, there's never been a better moment to tell these kinds of stories in a way that can go viral, right? Hersey's work, I guess by today's standards, we could say it went viral. It had an international audience. It was an international sensation when it went out. Most reporting did not and does not. We have so many outlets now to tell and relay survivor stories, whether it's, from the increasingly waning community of Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors to people who were in proximity to bombing tests in the Pacific or around the world. For me, as a journalist and again, as a historian, a storyteller of nuclear narratives, Hersey's especially instructive in terms of reminding us to always bring it back to the human level, because nukes are a very difficult, the science is hard to grasp for most people. The prospect of Armageddon and the end of civilization is an unfathomable concept. The level of destruction is unfathomable. There's so much that's hard to understand and hard to wrap your head around. But what Hersey does is, again, he brings it back to this granular human level, and anybody can understand that. You don't need to understand the exact process of how, a plutonium implosion device works to understand that it's bad, when it's dropped over a city of civilians. And so I think that as much as we can do to really publicize individual testimonies and also really give a platform to experts who have a gift for relaying stories and information about nuclear threat in an accessible way will go a long way. So for instance, I just did a story for the New York Times about Trinity's fallout and a new study that showed that it went a lot further than, surprise, surprise, than initially projected. And I interviewed Alex Wellerstein, who's a well-known nuclear historian, for it. And he's just so gifted at making difficult to understand information accessible, almost congenially in a way. And, what it does is you're not dumbing down the information. You're certainly not sacrificing accuracy, but you are making it accessible to civilians and to voters, frankly. So I just think that that's incredibly important. So accessibility and human level granular stories are big assets in relaying the nuclear threat.
Dr. Yuki Miyamoto, as a professor of nuclear ethics, emphasizes the importance of telling the stories of the Hibakusha and the human toll of the nuclear weapons to her students.
I take students to Hiroshima and Nagasaki for 2 weeks. And I started having this trip since 2005 and every other year. I admire students. It's not going to be an easy trip. And then they themselves, some of them are kind of apprehensive about going to these places. But I always assure them that you would be welcomed. People are so excited to see you and appreciate you choosing these places as your destination. And that's a good way to think about this issue as a kind of part of your history. Their stories will become a part of your stories when you talk about, well, when I went to Hiroshima, when I went to Nagasaki. So that's a good way. But I also understand that not everyone can go over there. But as I said, there are so many affected communities in the United States, and learning about them, learning about their stories, talking about their stories that is not against the stories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Actually, that's a good way to be connected to the stories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the legacies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I would like to continue my trips, and I would encourage people to go there, but also I would encourage people to learn about those affected communities throughout the United States.
Here's another story. Sadako Sasaki was 2 years old when she survived the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, though she then fell sick with leukemia because of the long-term effects of radiation poisoning. In the hospital, she attempted to fold 1,000 paper cranes in the hope that her wish to live would be granted. After her death, her legacy has been carried on. Her story has inspired so many, and paper cranes have become a symbol of peace for anti-nuclear activists. Organizations in our field, like the Nuclear Threat Initiative, launches the Cranes for Our Future campaign every year, which asks people to fold a crane and make a wish for a safer world, one without nuclear weapons. We must continue to tell the stories of those who survived the atomic bombing in Hiroshima. The experiences of those who survived cannot be forgotten. Years after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese community still feels the effects, and the recent release of Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer and the 78th anniversary of the bombing has brought the conversation back up.
The movie is based upon the book called American Prometheus. And of course, Prometheus is a bringer of fire, but also the symbol of perpetual self-destruction. And in the movie, self-destruction part seems to be only reduced to Oppenheimer's suffering, after the bombing, and some sense of guilt and anti-communism, anti-Semitism, and all those things happened to him. But think about self-destruction. We have conducted 1,032 nuclear tests. We have destroyed so many people's lives, so much of the environment.
We can do better. We have to, if we want our world to be safer and more secure.
So this is definitely the economic issue. This is definitely a racial issue. This is definitely the environmental issues. So there are many different approaches, but we can start from where we live, and we can expand from there, and learning from the affected communities. That would be wonderful.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited by Angela Kellett and Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is Black Nymph by Peridot. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.